I'm Larry Lee, president and publisher of the Sacramento Observer newspaper, and this is just, I can't even tell you how excited I am about this evening, being able to have a few minutes to talk publicly with someone who I considered a very dear friend, Mr. Ben Jealous, who he reminded me we've known each other for about 25 years, when we were both 10.
Yeah. You went great so fast, right?
We both had more and darker hair, both of us. You know, it's just, he's been such a wonderful friend, first of all, but an amazing human rights advocate and activist, as I've observed his career, you know, from afar and sometimes up close. And it's just, I'm just very thankful that he asked me to sit here and spend some time with him and talk, like I said, talk publicly. We can have off the record conversations.
Yes, but let's try not to do that.
But we won't do that. Hot mic. Ben is traveling the country right now, with the release of his new book. What I'd like for you to do, just kind of start off at the very beginning, tell us a little bit about where you are now, because you're getting ready to take over a new role in the next week or two, I think, and how you kind of got there professionally. Then we'll talk a little bit more about the book.
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here with you. This block seems like the Wakanda of Sacramento. Good job, Kevin. Very, very impressive. I've heard you describe it, but it's something else to experience it. And Adrian did an incredible job. You know, just what a joy to sit down with you, Larry. We were young Turks, if you will, in the black press a quarter century ago. I was, in some ways, the journey of this book started, the stories in this book from, you know, with my years as a journalist in Mississippi, at the Jackson Advocate, which is the Sacramento Observer of Mississippi. But when you're in Mississippi and you do what the Observer does, you get blown up 4 times in the 80s and 90s. We were last firebombed in 98. We were riddled with machine gun bullets, submachine gun bullets in the early 90s. And I was so glad when I took over the Trade Association of Black Newspapers to find out that I wasn't the only young black person crazy enough to invest a career in the black press, which everybody's been saying has been dying, but it's not. And it's thriving in a lot of places, and Sacramento is one of those places. And Larry, thank you. Thank you for what you do, brother. Thank you. And also just, you know, it's good to be home in Northern California, and folks surprise you. And my Aunt Bauer, our moms were in the Peace Corps together. And my mom recruited her mom and Dave Chappelle's dad to Yellow Springs, Ohio, a long time ago. And we're kind of a tribe. So it's just, that last time I was in Sacramento was with Dave and Chris Rock, and tonight with Ann. So there's something magical about Sacramento. It's nice to see you, Ann. You know, I'm going to be taking over the Sierra Club on the 28th of February. In a lot of places, that seems odd for a black guy to run a green group. It's never happened. There's been never been a major environmentalist organization led by a black person ever in the United States. Despite the fact that Van Jones has been running around for 20 years saying there is no green vote without the black or brown vote, because Latinos are number 1 and blacks are number 2 as far as being the base of the environmentalist movement when it comes to supporting environmental regulation. Or it's been about half a century since a major conservationist magazine, a cover story, said the greenest caucus in the U.S. Congress. It was a photo of the Congressional Black Caucus.
Wow.
Big oil, big gas has been hip to that ever since then. They hired an army of lobbyists, matched them all up with the CBC. The Sierra Club, the nice thing is walking the door is the most inclusive of all the major environmentalist groups. I can say it with some authority because I worked for another major green group when I was 21. It only lasted 6 months. I came to the launch a big national program. It was a success. My first day, the one black executive pulled me in her office and said, "How does it feel to work for a white organization?" "No, that won't change anytime soon." And I went to the one black executive over at Greenpeace, who was sort of the ombudsman for us young Greens, and I said, "Brother, like, whoa." It was my black mama that wrote checks to that organization. Like, what are they talking about? And he's like, "Yeah, it's a lot of work, man. You might just want to go back to civil rights." And I did. But I never left the environmentalist movement. I Started the first years ago. I was 15 in Monterey, California. You know, we were black kids growing up around redwood trees. Like, that exists. That happens in Northern California. Here we are. And my parents were kind of hippies and bohemians, I think they would argue. And they raised me up. They raised me, when we would go camping, the way they would get me out of the tent was to insist I sleep in the base of a burned out redwood tree. So when I was 15, a company in Max Zam started clear cutting out here. I started the first high school chapter of the Student Environmental Action Coalition. That was how my path started. I'd grown up going to civil rights protests. I've organized a lot since, but the first protest I ever helped organize was an anti-clear cutting rally here in Sacramento. And my first order of business at the NAACP was launching our climate justice program. And the beautiful thing about black folks is, like, we just want to know what the truth is. So when a lot of green groups felt awkward after Hurricane Katrina, after Galveston, after all those disasters, floods in the Iowa River, just walking in and saying, this is what's going on, y'all, and this is how we stop it. The NAACP was doing that all across this country, and a woman named Jackie Patterson. So when Sierra Club called, you know, I said, it sounds like a fun challenge. It feels like coming full circle. And honestly, what I heard in my ear, and I'm going to close on this, was the voice of Lou Gossett Jr. Lou and I in 2013 were a little drunk at the end of the Image Awards, late at night. I'm not sure we were drunk from exhaustion or alcohol, but both were involved. And he leans over to me and he says, you know, I've been in this racial justice fight my whole life, Ben. I said, I know, Lou. He said, but you know, sometimes I feel like we're fighting over who's in first class. And what we need to do is look out the window of the airplane and recognize that we've lost 25,000 feet of altitude in the last 3 minutes. So maybe if we did that, we wouldn't be so focused on who's in first class. We'd be running through the plane trying to find the smartest person to get him in the cockpit. Because Ben, who's ever in that cockpit is either drunk, asleep, or dead. I said, Lou, that's beautiful, brother, but what are you talking about? And he said, the planet, Ben, the planet's dying. And it don't matter who's in first class on a dead planet. So it's going to be a challenge. But I'm excited, and I'm putting together a great team of leaders, both who are there and folks who are pivoting from other careers to come in. And we will build, the nice thing about the Sierra Club is that it is, how do I say this? It is a kind of uncomfortably large coalition to start with. And that's what gives me hope that we can build a coalition big enough to win. I never expected to make it to 50. If we want to get into that in this book conversation, we can. It shreds it out in the book. I thought I'd be dead by 43 like my paternal grandfather. And at 41, when I stepped down as head of the NAACP, all signs were pointing that direction. My blood pressure had gone up for reasons nobody could explain to me, from 127 to 186 in 5 years, and showed no sign of heading in a different direction. And so I'm a little nostalgic because I turned 50 a couple weeks ago. I'm excited because I figured out what was going to kill me. I figured out what had killed my paternal grandfather, and I dealt with it. It was undiagnosed sleep apnea, and I dealt with it. Well, my black granddad, that's my white granddad. My black granddad lived to 92. His bride just passed at 105.
Oh, wow.
And so now I feel like I got another whole half century in front of me. And I'm pretty excited about, that. But looking back, this book in some ways was a capstone in the first half century of my life. And one of the blessings of the first half century of my life is that I was trained by multiple proteges of Thurgood Marshall. I started as an organizer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund when I was 18. His main protege, the man who he chose to run the Legal Defense Fund when he stepped down to be Solicitor General, was Jack Greenberg. He was dean of my college at Columbia College, and he's the one who opened the door for me. And I've also was trained by multiple proteges of Martin Luther King, Reverend Orange, Andy Young, Joe Lowry. I worked very closely with all of them. I also worked closely with Desmond Tutu. But the proteges of King would often say something that I never saw him say in any speech. They'd say, this is how Dr. King trained us. The first thing was always, if you can't say it in 25 words or less, come back when you can, because nobody's going to remember, brother, what you're saying. And the second was, if you're comfortable in your coalition, then your coalition is too small. If you're comfortable in your coalition, your coalition is too small. So my ambition for the Sierra Club is to make it bigger than the Democratic Party. Because that's how you save this planet, and that's how you get this country to lead. When you're a partisan issue, well, Norm Mineta would tell you that's how his people got interned. That they allowed one party to become an anti-Japanese American party. We cannot allow one party to be an anti-planet Earth party. We've got to build a coalition bigger than the Democratic Party, and that's what I'll be focused on.
Okay. That's wonderful. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's new technology.
Yeah, I want to make sure we don't lose.
We'll just put it up here. All right.
So that brings us, that's a wonderful summary as to why you are where you are now. Let's talk about the book for a little bit. I talked loosely, you said this book in particular is reflection with your grandmother.
Yeah.
Tell us a little about Mamie Todd Bland, right?
So Mamie Todd Bland, Mamie Bland Todd, the publicist keeps getting backwards. Because we talk about the Bland family so much in the book. But Mamie Bland Todd, Mamie Bland was a tough chick. She worked for Planned Parenthood in 1940 in Baltimore, Maryland, a Catholic city and a Catholic state. At 12, her father approached her with a Model A Ford with the engine in pieces. So I took the engine completely apart. When you can get the engine back together, you can drive it. I'll go to the sheriff. She was the second eldest, but she was the most responsible of the kids. I'll go to the sheriff and I'll get you a special driver's license just to drive in this county, Dinwiddie, Virginia, to get you and your 5 siblings to school. But I need to know, this is Jim Crow, Virginia, that if you ever break down the road, you can fix it quickly. So he took the engine apart. And by the time she was 13, it was back together. If you ever want to hear her voice, you can put in StoryCorps, Ben Jealous, Mamie Todd, or Ben Jealous, Mamie, it'll come right up. She told a story, it's in the book, about the day that she had just had enough as a teacher. The chalkboard officially no longer retained chalk in her classroom, and she had no way to teach. Her grandfather, whose soul was at the center of this book, had built the one-room schoolhouse she was educated in, and he had given the land for all of the black schools in that county. And when she showed up at the school district, there was still acknowledgement of him by the front door to the school district building. But Jim Crow had set in. Reconstruction was long since over. And they told her to come around back. And she said, well, my granddaddy's name is right next to the front door. I think I'll come through it. And she sat down with the superintendent with a great sense of equality, because that's ultimately something you have to choose to give up. And she just told him what was what she needed, and when she needed it by. And the next day, a truck showed up laden with supplies for the entire school that she was teaching in. So that was my grandma. She was my hero. But she left me with a couple of mysteries. One of them is the title of the book, Never Forget Our People Were Always Free. The other was that there was a black woman who was a soldier in the civil rights movement. She was the secretary for a group, the other 3 members of which were family. Clarence Mitchell, the top lobbyist for the NAACP, Perrin Mitchell, the first black congressman from Baltimore, and Juanita Mitchell, the founder of the NAACP Youth and College Division, the president, second generation president of the Baltimore NAACP, which is, of course, the branch that gave us Thurgood Marshall. It's a pretty powerful branch. And she was the secretary of their group in planning the implementation of the war on poverty in Maryland and in Baltimore. And so the other riddle was why she was more on fire to end poverty than racism. She fought both with all her heart, but she could keep you in a corner telling you stories about poor white folks in rural Maryland literally till the cows came home. And so that's what I had to figure out those things while she was still with us, and I barely did.
Yeah. So what things from her did you learn that helped kind of shape your work and your life's journey?
The most important lesson I learned from her was empathy. When your parents' marriage was against the law, not long before you were born, my parents had to leave Maryland because they were very much in love and it was very much against the law. And they ultimately settled out here in Northern California. But even though it had been illegal out here, just folks knew that like you kind of came from a foreboding marriage, if you will. Kids can be quite cruel. And I came home one day, I was frustrated because we had had a talk like a year earlier where I had jumped the neighborhood bully when he was on roller skates because I had an advantage for about a half hour, and we needed the bullying to stop. And this was the 70s. We weren't sophisticated in dealing with bullying. And so she said, I don't want you to ever be in a fight that you can walk away from. So then I came back to her and I was like, these kids keep saying stuff. You tell me to walk away from the fight. Well, how do I deal with it? And you have to understand I was little. I was the shortest person in my freshman class of high school. I was shorter than the Japanese American girls. She's still 5'2", but I was shorter than her. And I was the tallest person in my senior class. But this is me when I was little. And I said to her, what do I do? And she said, oh, baby, just feel sorry for them. Imagine how difficult it is just to walk around that hateful all the time. Baby, for some people, just having to be themselves is punishment enough. And I was like, wow, I kind of like that. I stopped feeling sorry for me, I'll start feeling sorry for them. Changed my whole life. But it also taught me an important lesson, which, life has affirmed many times. Which is no baby comes into this world full of hate. Somebody else sticks it in them. Somebody else abuses them, humiliates them, belittles them. And those bullies were, frankly, deserving of more sympathy than they got. And maybe if some adults had shown it to them, they wouldn't have been such terrors to me.
And so that sort of motivation and that sort of empathy related to racism and poverty, as that shaped your life's work, how did you, how were those such driving factors? Because you've always been in this work. You've literally dropped 5 or 6 different paths in your career from 18 on that have been driven toward righting the wrongs of this country. I can't, and I want to come to your parents next, but I'm sure that a lot of these seeds were planted with your grandmother, or what. Guess what I'm trying to
sort of where does the peripatetic nature of my activism come from?
There you go. Okay, somebody look that up for me, please. In case you didn't know, I was also a Vogue scholar.
That. Kevin, what it means is that you and I have more in common than you realize, And what I'd say is, when you look at what Kevin's doing here, when you look at my life, journalist, investor, civil rights leader, professor, writer, if you try to figure out, well, what's the precedent for that? The precedent for that is the first generation out of slavery. Look at Frederick Douglass. Builder, statesman, federal marshal, orator, organizer, ally, journalist, newspaper publisher. We could go on for all the things Frederick Douglass did. But they were all in pursuit of a single mission, which was to advance his people and advance this nation. And Douglass was a tremendous ally. I remember when people said I was somehow taking the NAACP off course because we were going to fight for marriage equality for people other than just black folks, which, by the way, we were in the beginning, their white spouses. I mean, marriage equality fight has always been about more than just black folks, because we wanted to fight for marriage equality for the LGBTQ community. And first I had to remind people there's gay black people. There's no, come on. But the thing that always kind of gave me solace was Frederick Douglass was so clear that all of us were free, none of us were free, that when the 15th Amendment was passed, that gave black men the right to vote, because women couldn't vote. Frederick Douglass celebrated it as like the principal, sort of like the kind of crowning achievement of his life, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment. And then said, but I'm not going to vote until women can vote too. Dropped the mic and walked away. And so, in other words, he lived his life like water. Water knows its destination. It's down. It's the lowest point it can get to. And it finds any crack to move through, and then it makes that crack wider. When I came into the Silicon Valley as a tech investor, which I am still, I was the 36th black man in the Silicon Valley who could write a check as an institutional investor to start a tech company. Now there are hundreds. It's only 8 years later. It has something to do with Jesse Jackson shaming some folks. It has something to do with a lot of young people working real hard and founding companies, and it's a natural progression. It has something to do with the former head of the NAACP showing up and put a spotlight on it. And that's ultimately, as noble a life, Frederick Douglass's say is W.B. Du Bois, or somebody who was kind of much more on one path, much more on one path. And so, in some ways this book is an homage to that generation, because Edward David Bland, my grandmother's grandfather, who's at the heart of this book, he was a preacher, he was a cobbler, he was a farmer, he was a whiskey gauger, and his son was a whiskey gauger, he was a lighthouse keeper. He did a lot of things, and he was a statesman who built a third political party that took over Virginia with a former Confederate general. And that was the part that really, I never knew that. I was always told, Grandma's granddaddy was a Reconstruction statesman. No, he was a statesman in 1880, 4 years after the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, 5 years into the Reign of Terror of the Ku Klux Klan, well after the end of Reconstruction, but before the rise of Jim Crow. And I was told that he helped start Virginia State University, and that's true, and we're quite proud of that. My grandparents went there. But that wasn't even the half of it. In researching this book, what I realized is there's an entire epic of history that they don't teach us about, and I would say likely with good reason. I mean, anybody ever told, there was this epic of American history where Johnny Reb and the freedmen got together and took over multiple state governments? Yeah, no, they never tell you that. Why? Because what came right after it, Jim Crow, and what was the most threatening idea you could possibly be teaching children about during Jim Crow? That Johnny Reb and the freedmen got together and took over multiple state governments and did great things. And this is the story of that. So I'm sitting there researching this book. My grandmother was in love with her grandfather, the way I was in love with my grandma. And she couldn't help talking about him. But I wanted to know more. So I went on Wikipedia. He has a Wikipedia page. I started digging through it. Called some historians down to Virginia, went and sat down with them. Edward David Bland was the leader of the Black Republicans just after the end of Reconstruction, 8 years before the rise of Jim Crow. The principal achievement of the Black Republicans during Reconstruction was starting the free public schools in each state in the South. And Virginia was no different. The old plantation oligarchs were feeling themselves because they had just gotten the right to vote back, and they knew it was just a matter of time till they took back over the state governments. And so, in a fit of hubris, they said, we can't afford this Civil War debt, so we're going to shut down the public schools because we can't afford both. Without thinking about just how many white people depended on those public schools. So the first step was that working class white men bolted the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party back then was the conservative party aligned with the Klan. Bolted the Democratic Party and started their own party, and their party was named after their demand. Readjust the Civil War debt so we can keep our public schools. And their leader was he was a class traitor in many people's eyes because he was a railroad baron, and all the other railroad barons were in the process of crushing populist rebellions. But he decided to join one, and his reasoning was simple. He's like, but I run a Southern Railroad, and we're never going to get the dollars we need without a populous base. So I better join my workers rather than fight them. So he joined them. And when my grandmother's grandfather approached him to strike a bargain, it was no small deal because General William B. Mahone, was a notorious general. He was the only one that Robert E. Lee, who writing this book I figured out was my cousin, and that set me off kilter for a week. I couldn't write a word, and drank whiskey and tea and stared out the window. Lord, you got jokes. What have you done here? But William B. Mahone was known for a couple of reasons. One was he was the only general that Robert E. Lee said was fit to succeed him. Two was he was a bona fide war criminal. The Battle of the Crater could have ended the Civil War. A black regiment took the field that day. They'd been trained for that battle, and they were doing their job very well. A white Union general panicked. Oh my God, the entire Civil War is about to be won by a black regiment. And pulls them off the field. Pushes out a white regiment that wasn't trained for the battle. They get mowed down by General Mahone. General Mahone said it was like shooting turkeys. He so thoroughly slaughters that white regiment that when the black regiment is y'all go back on the battlefield. They literally take a knee and surrender. Well, General Mahone had saw how fearsome they were just a few hours earlier. So he massacres all of them. But here they were, 15 years after the end of the Civil War. 5 years into fighting the Klan, 4 years in the future, 6 people will be assassinated in their bid for re-election. And if an old war criminal shares your political objectives and you're fighting with the Ku Klux Klan, well, better they got to deal with him than you. And so he approached him, and they struck a bargain that my grandmother's grandfather would lead black folks into the Readjuster Party. And he did such an overwhelming job that it was ultimately a majority black party led by a former Confederate general and a freedman. Wow. They won the governorship. They took majorities in both houses of the state legislature, and back then the state legislature appointed the U.S. senators. They controlled the whole game. And what did they do? They saved the free public schools. They radically expanded Virginia Tech, making it what you know it to be today, kind of the working person's answer to UVA, the patrician UVA. Figured out that we descend from Thomas Jefferson's grandma writing this book too. I used to joke, my family, we're black in the Jeffersonian model of blackness. And it wasn't a joke. Yeah. just we got the receipts. And it's right here. And so they radically expanded Virginia Tech. They created what would become Virginia State University, the first publicly supported college for teachers south of the Mason-Dixon. It would quadruple the number of black teachers in Virginia in 4 years. They abolished the public whipping post that was used exclusively for blacks well after the Civil War to torture us in the town square. They raised corporate taxes, taking the government from a deficit to a surplus. They raised wages, and they abolished the poll tax. And that last part got me thinking, and I went and did a little bit of research, and I'll close on this. The poll tax, of course, would be reinstated. There would be a campaign of disinformation. It would spark violence in places like Danville, just like we saw in Buffalo, or people literally, back then it was pamphlets, it wasn't the internet, but it was the same type of thing. Lies were spread that black men were raping white women in the town square in Danville. It wasn't true. White supremacists were angry because Danville had an integrated city council and an integrated police force. And white supremacists, crazy people came and shot up and killed blacks and whites in the street in Danville, thinking that they were stopping rapes that weren't happening. And then they lost. Multiple people assassinated in the re-election. They had controlled the government for 4 years. They planted seeds for the New Deal coalition. FDR's old lieutenants in Virginia were William B. Mahone's and Edward David Bland's young lieutenants in Virginia. They reinstated the poll tax, and then they ultimately wove it into the state constitution. And when they wove the poll tax into the state constitution about a decade and a half after they defeated Blaine and Mahone, it disenfranchised 80% of blacks. We were all taught that. It also disenfranchised 50% of whites. Didn't focus on that so much. In other words, they outlawed the multiracial populist coalition that had taken control of the government. Because the whites that couldn't afford the poll tax were the same whites that would have joined a multiracial populist rebellion. And then, what hit me, what I'm trying to teach people in this book, and I'm a professor, so I'm talking a little long, but from a stock of Baptist preachers, so yes, I can talk all the time. But as I was researching this book, and what I'm trying to teach people is what Dr. King was trying to teach us at the end of his life. He was not assassinated leading a desegregation battle. He was assassinated leading a poor people's campaign, trying to get poor white folks and poor black folks together. Because yes, we experience racism, black folks, people of color, as like the boot on our neck, as the nightstick against our head, as the bullet in our back. But it's not just that, and it never has been. How do colonies survive? What was the strategy of kings to maintain the colonies from which they extracted great wealth? Divide and conquer. Racism is a wedge, y'all. That's what Dr. King was trying to understand, that everybody who gets divided loses. At the end of the day, the word race had been around for 600 years and its meaning had never changed until 1720. You hear phrases from the old definition of race. I once heard a drunk Irishman say, "We Irish are a mighty race." And then a drunk Scotsman, when I was a bartender in England, yelled, "We Scots are a mighty race." Yeah, that's the original definition of the word race. Tribe or nation when applied to people, genus or type when applied to things. But around 1720, it became synonymous with this crazy pseudoscience that asserted that multiple human races existed, despite the obvious evidence that was a bunch of BS, which is people like me. We're called mulattoes because we're likened to mules. Well, mules can't have babies, but I got two. So there you go. It's just one human race. But that myth keeps taking casualties, and not just from the police. The NFL admitted a year and a half ago that they had been discounting black men's intelligence and denying them settlements for traumatic brain injury to which they were entitled because they presumed we were just naturally less intelligent, Kevin. Like, WTF, man. And it explains in part why they dropped so much money on black folks to perform at the halftime show. But that is the unfinished business. And what struck me as I thought about Dr. King was, King wasn't assassinated leading black people. He was assassinated when he sought to lead all people. Of all the Black Panthers who were assassinated, Bunchy, Carter, like all those guys, which one was the assassination most premeditated, most carried out like a military operation?
Fred Hampton.
And what was Fred Hampton trying to do?
Unite
the people, the Rainbow Coalition, bring the Young Patriots, the Black Panthers together, and every group in between. Before Medgar Evers was shot ruthlessly by a coward in his driveway, going home to Murley, the NAACP leader who was assassinated with the fiercest force of any of them before or after was a man named Harry Moore. He and his wife Harriet went to bed Christmas night, not Christmas Eve, but Christmas night, celebrated with the children, took the children to bed upstairs in their ranch house, went to sleep downstairs in the ranch house. The Klan back then was doing sneak attacks in the early 1950s. They packed the crawl space so full of dynamite that when they lit the fuse, not even a tooth would be found. I sat with one of the Moore's daughters. She lived in College Park, Maryland, and she was in her 80s. She was still a shell when talking about what happened to her parents. Well, what was Harry Moore doing that made him need to be assassinated in such a thorough way? The three things. He was president of the NAACP. In the era of the poll tax, almost 15 years before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, he had registered 1 million people in Florida to change the politics of the state. And he was also president of the Florida Progressive Party, organizing white folks and black folks and bringing them together. Colonies are maintained through divide and conquer. They tried to stop multiracial rebellions in Virginia in the 1600s with the military. It didn't quite work. They passed new laws. It didn't quite work. Then they tried culture, and honestly, in truth, it didn't quite work. So they did something else that Ron DeSantis is doing now. They just started lying. They just started hiding. They just started not telling the story. When I grew up, my dad's family's from Massachusetts. I'll show you how thorough this is. When I grew up, there were two versions of the Boston Massacre. There was one image created by Paul Revere that removed all black people from the scene. There was one image created by abolitionists that inserted one black name named Crispus Attucks. Both images are incorrect. You know how we know? Because there's another forefather who made a record of that day. His name is John Adams. One day he would be president, so would his son, but that day he was the defense lawyer for the military men, British, who killed the young Americans in the Boston Massacre. And when John Adams defended the Redcoats, you know what he said to say that their violence was justified? The crowd was full of Negroes, mulattoes, and Jack tars. Jack tar was a term for the poorest white sailor. The other two terms are terms for black people. If there was only one, why would he be redundant? That's not what you're taught. That's what none of our kids are taught. And so ultimately, I believe one of the reasons I'm so hopeful about the future of this country is there's a magnet that pulls people together across racial lines again and again. It's their own children. It's their aspiration for their families. It's their ability to count in a democracy and say, you know, we keep hitting our head up against this brick wall. But if we had a few more friends, we could break through. That's what makes me hopeful about it.
I want to create a little time for a couple questions, but I want to ask you a couple things. So, have the events, judging on based off what you just said, have the events of the last few years, post 2016, we'll just call it 2016. We all know what happened in 2016. Post 2016, has that reinforced your thoughts about racism, and the changes that can come, or has it chipped away at it?
You know, I look at race relations. I take stock of race relations like I do my stock portfolio, which is like not often. Because if you try day trading, you'll be a nervous wreck. And, you know, you're better off just like checking in once a year. You know, honestly, if it's your retirement fund, you know, your teacher with TIA, CREF, whatever, like I am, I check in once every 5 years, you know, just fine. The professionals handle that stuff. No, seriously, man, this is, I guess, the 5th century of America, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. 3 gives you a trend. I'd say the trend has been affirmed. The centuries start off terrible and they end a bit better. Every single time. I had a black woman stand up in D.C. who was bereft because her grandchild had just been born. She should be celebrating. But she's like, what are we bringing him into? What do I do? I said, what do you do? I was like, sister, you have the faith that your grandma had. Let's dial it back 100 years. 1923. We'd be like 2 years after Red Summer, when all the vets had been lynched, all the black vets coming back to war, we would be a year before Black Wall Street was burned. We'd be in the time when white folks were getting fabulously rich, and most black folks were stuck in deep poverty. And by the end of the century, everything had gotten better in ways that were hard to deny. Still a lot of trouble, but things better. So I'm betting we're on the same, because it's been the same every century. Now, why am I more hopeful? You know, my grandmother would say, look, like we tried that New South thing twice. She's like, but I'm pretty sure the third time we win. Why is that, Grandma? You know, it's aside. One of my grandmother's favorite sayings, to stick with me, she said, you know, because when you go to an elite college, the first thing that they do is they make you jaded. And, you know, and you learn it's actually the easiest way to be right is to just always be like the most depressing person at the party. Yeah, but. And so I came back from Columbia proud of how jaded I was at 17. And my grandma was like, oh, baby, stop. She's like, I mean, it's, you know, it's true. She's like, pessimists like you are right more often, but optimists win more often. She said, baby, you got to figure out which one's more important to you. As for me, I'll take winning. And so, admittedly, she's an optimist, but she would tell you this about this country. She would say, the first time that the New South was tried, it was built on false numbers. All the Confederates had been disenfranchised. It wasn't going to last forever. They'd be reenfranchised and we would lose. And that's what happened. And she said, by the way, my granddad knew that was going to happen. The second time, it was built on false numbers again. White folks down south kept voting straight Democratic ticket. I don't know if you've ever been into a voting booth in Mississippi. They say poverty is the greatest form of historic preservation. When I was a young reporter in the early 90s in Mississippi, the voting machines were the same they had been since 1950. You could vote for each candidate if you wanted, or you could just press a button at the top, pull it, and you would vote for the entire, straight down. Just pop all of them all at once and walk out. 30 seconds, you just voted for 30 offices. And so folks have, voting straight Democratic ticket. Well, Ronald Reagan went to Philadelphia, Mississippi to launch his presidential campaign and put an end to that. Yep. False numbers. This time, in the middle of this century, by the time we get to 2050, this nation will be a nation of minorities. White folks will be a minority too. There's a lot of white folks like my dad. And my dad, I'm a black guy who comes from a long line of white guys. My family on that side's been here since 1624, Salem, Massachusetts. The first ancestor to come over gave 200 acres to start Harvard. They've been like real white for a long time. and my dad my dad's like, great, finally my people have to get along with other people demographically to succeed democratically. But it's just logical. If you stay on the balcony, if you get on the balcony of history where my grandmother lived, say the last 20 years of her life, from 85 to 105. She'd say it's also logical that when white supremacy was about to end as the numeric basis for our democracy, that some folks would just want to hold on to the old way. Some of this hate change. You don't have to be racist to hate change. You just don't want things to change with all they got. The farm girl in her, though, would say, but the racist ones, the worst ones, they're kind of like foxes. Like on most days, they're kind of meek and mischievous. Cowards. But the point that they're most vicious is when they're backed into a corner. And the farmer who's a good shot takes heart in that moment because they realize the fox is so vicious because the fox just figured out everything's about to change in a way that fox ain't prepared to handle. And so, yes, the viciousness, the darkness of this moment is an affirmation that they know too, that things will change, and that dawn is coming.
All right. Okay. Well, yeah. So let's open it up. We might have time for maybe 2 questions. Carolyn, put your hand up first, so you need to get around the room.
Okay. I'm Benjo. First, I want to reintroduce myself, Carolyn Beal Hunter. I'm the state treasurer of the NAACP, and I met you when you were serving as president.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Thank you for your service.
You mentioned divide and conquer a couple times. Divide and conquer, and you talked about this hopefulness that you see coming forward. But here in California, where you've seen what happened in this LA City Council, and you talked about this being a growing minority, and we're looking at the Harvard Law School case on affirmative action, it doesn't feel like we're really recognizing and understanding our strength as minorities, that if we could come together, that we could win. And so just kind of have to get your take on that.
Sure.
As we move toward this hopefulness.
when Larry had no gray hair. We were in Washington, D.C., Black Press Week. The young Turks or Tykes, depending on who was talking, of the Black Press, with all the old publishers. And in our midst was a man, Frank Bolden. Frank was the quintessential black newspaper editor of his day. His paper, the Pittsburgh Courier, he was city editor at the time, had led blacks into the Democratic Party during the era of FDR. He was one of 2 black reporters accredited to interview the troops and world leaders by the U.S. Army during World War II. In one year, he interviewed Nkrumah, Gandhi, Stalin, Khrushchev, FDR, Churchill, and Nehru. Said Nkrumah, I meant Khrushchev. And he, and so he came with a lot of respect, but what he was known for was the Pittsburgh Courier would come up with these campaigns, and other black newspapers would pick them up and run with them. And the most famous one was the Double V campaign. Victory over authoritarianism at home, victory over authoritarianism abroad, victory over Jim Crow, victory over Hitler. And black newspapers across the country carried that. So an old publisher raised his hand, he said, when I was a boy, you guys always had those campaigns all of us would run. If you were going to give us a campaign today, what would it be, Frank? And Frank said that every black person should learn to speak Spanish. We used to have people like Dr. Lee leading most black newspapers, but at this point it was the old ad guys who ran most of the papers, right? I mean, let's be truthful. They were not tracking. Raises his hand. Why, Frank? Well, I don't know how it is for you brothers, but wherever I lived, it's the blacks, it's the Latinos, and it's the progressive whites. It's not enough for us to just tell Latinos that we're their friends. We gotta show them. We gotta take one step towards them. We require all of them to learn English. Seems like we should try to learn a little Spanish. And then they might trust that we're serious about working together. What about the progressive whites, Frank? Oh man, the blacks and Latinos truly get along. Progressive whites will fall right in line, and the 3 of us run every city in America. Now that was a man approaching 100 saying exactly what he thought, which is beautiful about people approaching 100. There's a lot of truth in that. The point of this book is, please practice the golden rule with courage and with faith. Black folks aren't used to being the second largest group of color. And yet, nobody can take away our history or the level of organization in our community, which is the real source of our power, is that we hang together. And Latinos in California, well, this place used to be Mexico. So it's, I think, appropriate here for us, again, to practice the golden rule with courage, with faith, and resist the urge to be, afraid. Consider all who would profit from making us remember the foolishness of a few city council people, more than we remember the love that Dr. King and Cesar Chavez had for each other. We know how to build coalitions and win. Black folks know that better than most folks in this country. We just got to stick to our knitting and do what we're good at.
All right, one more. Oh. Go ahead, Ken. I was gonna.
President Obama's inauguration. Mm-hmm. We were together.
Mm-hmm.
Tell how powerful a moment that was for you. Backstage, underground, coming up, and witnessing history.
I mean, I was thinking about my granddad all day because I called my granddad and I had told him I was going to support Obama. And this wasn't I called him when I supported Jesse Jackson. And he kind of saw it the same way. You know, he was 91 years old or so, and you know, being black in America had left him, you know, a sour taste in his mouth. And he's like, put your heart in that, son, but don't put it all the way in. Because it'll be a cold day in hell before one of us becomes president. And my grandfather died, never saw that day. That inauguration was the coldest day in Washington. And you know, he wouldn't be the first to refer to the nation's capital as hell. Politics is what it is, man. So, no, I mean, it was a wonderful day. I also learned something about 4 weeks later. I went to the Republican National Committee, and they were giddy. And I was like, I'm expecting y'all to be despondent. They had a plan for taking over governorships by the dozen and redistricting all the states in their favor for a generation. And they had just figured out that we didn't. And we've got to stick in. And the hardest thing, I was just down in Georgia and Mississippi. And black leaders down there, Democratic leaders down there will admit the obvious, which is back then we blinked. DOJ pre-approved Republican governor redistricting plans and gutted Southern legislatures. Democrats had always controlled the Mississippi legislature until 2010, black or white. And it will probably not happen again for 10 or 20 years. There's hope right now. If you want to be involved in a campaign right now, this year, in an odd year at that, support the Democrat running for Presley. He's Elvis Presley's cousin, running for governor in Mississippi. He's up 4 points in the last poll. If he wins, he will get reelected, and if he does, he will control redistricting down there. You know, it was an incredible moment. Democracy requires eternal vigilance. I don't fault anybody for blinking, but we, for the sake of our children, need to understand what we do. And the other thing I'd say is this. The beauty of Obama winning in this nation is he was the first black president. He's also, Barack Hussein Obama is the son of a man who gave him a name that most Americans, back when I was a kid, would say was a funny name. And so when the son of the immigrant is the first black president, it sends a sign to the whole nation. In a year when everybody expected a woman to be president, that any kid can be president. That to me was the greatest. Now I was in that fight from day one. I raised $12 million for what some academics say was the first, me and two buddies raised $12 million, Steve Phillips, Andy Wong, for what some people say was the first presidential super PAC to help him win the primary. And I'll tell you, Kevin, when I look back on it, what was perhaps even more transformative to the nation was having Michelle Obama as First Lady.
Hello.
Yeah.
When Kamala and I went out, there's a plane of us, about 20 of us, went out to see Obama announce in Springfield. And I spent most of my time, with the Obamas with Michelle, maybe 20, 30 minutes talking to her. We were talking about people saying, certain brothers aren't black enough or whatever. She's like, he's black enough for the cab drivers to refuse to take him across town.
Yeah.
She was so plain spoken, right? She was like all the sisters that we went to school with, and we admired and we grew up with. And I was like, I don't know how black America is going to respond to Barack Obama, but man, when they meet Michelle, and I was out here, you'll appreciate, you got some black clergy in Sacramento who are a little overly sophisticated sometimes. You've dealt with them, right? And so we had to meet up. There's a country club kind of between here and the Bay called Blackthorn or Black Hawk. Yeah, Black Hawk, yeah. So we met up there. These are the same brothers that had been with Ross Perot, right? We had all these black preachers, but there was this contingent from out here that are a little overly sophisticated. And I could see them like trying to figure out a reason not to support this brother. And so I stood up and I said, I can look at your faces and tell that 80% of you are with us and 20% of you are trying to figure out how to get out of here and not support our guy. So I just want you, as you go home, to think about this one thing. It's true we've never had a brother for president before. I said it's also true we've never had a president who woke up next to a black woman he took orders from every day. I'll just leave you all with that. All those pastors called me the next day to say that they were in for it. Because you know what they did? They went home to their wives. And their wives closed the deal.